I remember vividly, I spoke to an Iraqi of African descent who said he was so inspired by Obama's candidacy that he was running for the city council. It was something that he felt like he had to do.
Hello and welcome to Insights from Abroad. This podcast is part of the Middle East and South Asia Initiative in the College of Sciences at the University of Central Florida, and my name is Bryan Cruz. Our mission here is to educate, engage, and influence the international community. Today I am joined by Ambassador Gordon Gray to discuss some topics surrounding our Middle East series. Ambassador Gray, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So that listeners are aware, Gordon Gray is the former U.S. Ambassador to Tunisia. During his time in Tunis, Gray witnessed the collapse of the Ben Ali regime. He was involved in shaping the American response to the regional Arab Spring uprisings. An experienced career diplomat who has worked extensively in North Africa and the Middle East, Gray has also held posts in Morocco, Egypt, and Iraq. Ambassador Gray is currently the Chief Operating Officer at the Center for American Progress and is also a member of the American Foreign Service Association, the Middle East Institute, the American Academy of Diplomacy, and the Board of Directors of the Tunisian American Young Professionals Association. Gray has a BA in Political Science from Yale University and an MA in International Affairs from Columbia University. Ambassador Gray, your career as a diplomat is quite extensive. Could you share with us how you came to Foreign Service's career?
Certainly. I started my undergraduate studies as a political science major, and actually thought I was going to focus more on U.S. politics and domestic politics. Took an international relations course my freshman year, got more and more interested in it, and took more courses in the subject. And that's when I began to consider a career in the Foreign Service, but I'd never lived overseas before and thought I'd better do that. So when I graduated, I joined the Peace Corps, so I could test drive living overseas, and I was lucky enough to be sent to Morocco, which is a wonderful country. Enjoyed the time in Morocco, enjoyed living overseas, and took Foreign Service exam and off to the races.
And in Morocco, in the Peace Corps, what did you do exactly? How did that help you get into Foreign Service?
My job, along with most of my colleagues, was teaching in a local high school. We taught English. The program was called Teaching English as a Foreign Language. We used to joke it actually should have been called Teaching English as a fourth or fifth language, because the students spoke Moroccan dialect, classical Arabic. Many of them spoke Berber at home. They learned French in school. So by the time came around to learning English, they were pretty good language learners, which was good for us as teachers. But it gave me exposure to a different culture. We had training in the language, which was very helpful. So it was good practice for the Foreign Service, good preparation.
So, having experience in entering this field, is there any advice or knowledge you would give to those interested in pursuing a similar career path?
Yes, I would say look at the skills that are necessary or desirable for a career, not necessarily even foreign policy. It could be international business, it could be the military, whatever. But overseas experience, living overseas is certainly valuable to have. And I would say also language skills, foreign language skills are good to acquire.
Yes, definitely. Okay. A pivotal moment in your career was your role as ambassador to Tunisia from 2009 until 2012, where you got first-hand experience on the Tunisian Revolution. Can you recall for us the political climate and the most notable events throughout your service there?
Certainly. Just as a bit of background, I arrived in Tunisia in September 2009. Ben Ali had been the increasingly authoritarian ruler of Tunisia since November 7th, 1987, so almost 22 years by the time I got there. The corruption was associated with him, and that was a source of grievance understandably for the Tunisian people. The closed political system was an even bigger source of grievance, I think. A little bit over a year before I arrived in the summer of 2008, there was a great deal of labor unrest in the center of the country, which the government was able to contain. Right after I arrived in October 2009, there were so-called presidential elections, but Ben Ali didn't face any serious opposition. Participation was very low. So there was a great deal of discontent, but it was below the surface. And that all changed starting December 17th, 2010, when an underemployed produce vendor, Mohammad set himself on fire after he was slapped by a policewoman and his scales for weighing produce were confiscated. That galvanized a series of protests which spread first in the interior of the country and then spread to the major cities, Tunis and Sfax on the coast. And as far as the most notable moments, as you asked when I was there, one was certainly January 14th, 2011, the day Ben Ali fled. And I would say another was October 23rd, 2011, when the Tunisians held the first free and fair elections in their history. I went to a number of different polling stations in Tunis on the day of the elections, and it was very inspiring to see. People were lined up in queues, but they were very patient because it was the first opportunity to vote. Some Tunisians brought Tunisian flags with them. Others brought their children with them because they wanted their children to partake in this historic moment. And in a country such as ours, where not only do we take voting for granted, but so many of our citizens don't even avail themselves of the opportunity, it was really inspiring to see the Tunisians go to the polls so enthusiastically and accept the results after they came down.
Wow, that is inspiring, like you said. So you said we take voting here for granted. How eager would you say were the Tunisian people to vote? Was there this resentment that you noted beforehand?
There was resentment below the surface about not being able to have real elections, and that was manifested in the very low participation rates. I remember after the elections that I alluded to in October 2009, the government said Ben Ali got 89% of the vote. Some people thought, well, that sounds 89% is, who gets, what democratically elected ruler gets or leader gets 89%? Right. That's probably, I thought that might have been inaccurate. I mean, it was a totally made up figure, I'm sure, but it may have been more or less an accurate figure. What I found harder to believe, incredible to believe, was they said there was a high participation rate. And I could tell just from going to, to polling stations. People voted with their feet by not walking to the polling stations.
Right. So despite like these proposed numbers, you could tell that this wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, no one voted because they knew except for the super loyal party members, because they knew their vote didn't matter. So why go to the trouble?
A gesture, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and having been there several years, what developments have you noticed since you left your post in 2012?
I would say that there were three major developments, and one would be in the political sphere, where the Tunisians have made a great deal of progress. They've had, I mentioned the 2011 elections. There were elections in 2014, peaceful transfer of power. New president came in effect, new members of parliament came in. There were municipal elections last year for the first time. There will be presidential and parliamentary elections later this year in the fall, and I'm sure they'll be conducted in the same free and fair manner that the others were. So politically, there's been a great deal of progress. There've been compromise. People think things aren't moving as quickly as they should, but we have the same frustrations about our democracy, and we've been doing it a lot longer than the Tunisians. The second development is less promising and more concerning, which is the economic situation. The unemployment rate really hasn't gone down, particularly among young people and university graduates. Obviously, it's a source of concern, but it's also a destabilizing factor. More and more people are saying, well, what was the point of the revolution if I don't have a job? And one of the slogans of the revolution was work, freedom, and dignity. And I think on the freedom part, in other words, the political liberties, the Tunisians have made great strides. The employment is more difficult, and they have not been as successful as they would like. They recognize it's a problem, but they haven't been able to deal with it. The third area of development, I'd say, would be the security situation. They had a couple of political assassinations, one in 2013, one in 2015, which is very unusual for the Tunisian political system. I don't believe there were any assassinations post-independence until that time. There were a number of terrorist incidents as well. But the security situation, knock on wood, has improved, and I think that's under control. Looking ahead and getting back to the economic, the corruption is more pervasive than it was. Some Tunisians refer to it sardonically as the democratization of corruption. It used to be just the family that was corrupt. Now it's more layers, and that's very closely tied to the economic situation.
All right, thank you. Do you believe that there is anything particularly unique about Tunisia that enabled it to democratize like perhaps other nations wouldn't be able to?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think that Tunisia had a lot of structural advantages that help explain why the Arab Spring was successful to the extent it has been successful. I'm not trying to minimize the challenges ahead in Tunisia as opposed to, say, the terrible bloodshed and loss of life and humanitarian disaster in say, Yemen or Syria. And there's a number of factors. One is it's a very homogeneous society. It's not they're not tribal differences or ethnic differences. The 98% of the population adheres to the same school of Islam. At the same time, it's tolerant. It's a tolerant society that's reflected in its constitution, but also in its society. It's got a large middle class. I believe the home ownership rate is higher in Tunisia than it is in the United States. Bourguiba, the first leader after independence, placed a premium on education, mandating it for all children, young adults, ages 6 to 16, and not just boys but also girls, which is very important. That leads into another structural advantage, which is the relatively speaking equality between men and women. It's the only Arab country in which polygamy is outlawed, for example. Great deal of familiarity with democratic institutions. Part of that is the number of Tunisians who work and live in Europe, and the pervasive nature of the European media. Many of the opposition leaders when they were in exile, were then opposition leaders, now part of the government, when they were in exile, were in Europe, so they saw democracy in action, and I think adhered to it. So I think when you add all those up, those are all necessary building blocks for a successful transition, at least in the political sense. Whether they're sufficient, time will tell. But I think they had a number of advantages or have a number of advantages that other countries weren't so blessed to have.
Right. And it's very important to note this because, as we stated, other countries don't have the same level of success that they have, and of course, while they have challenges, it's important to acknowledge the progress that has been made and of course, how that contributes. Right. So let's go back to your early assignments in foreign service. Sure. You served in Egypt for several years. Could you describe your objectives there?
Yeah, in Egypt, I had a slightly different role. I was the deputy chief of mission, so it was more, my primary responsibilities were the internal management of the embassy, while the ambassador had the responsibility for the relationship, bilateral relationship. And I was there 2002 to 2005. My primary responsibility and top objective when I got there was ensuring the security of the embassy community, and the larger American community, and we were able to do that, fortunately, successfully. But Egypt and the United States have such a rich relationship. There was all kinds of cooperation, all kinds of issues, be it Palestinian-Israeli issues, be it relations with Africa, relations with the other Arab world. The Arab League is headquartered in Cairo, so it was a great assignment in terms of the breadth of the relationship that we have with Egypt.
Are there any particular incidents or events that stood out to you during your service that you had a large role in or that you saw intimately?
I guess one of the events that really stood out to me was seeing the depth of the Egyptian opposition to our going into Iraq. It didn't surprise me, but it still stuck out because it was so vivid. At the same time, the Egyptians who I got to know, very friendly, very warm, one of the most hospitable societies I've ever enjoyed living in. So it was personally, it was a great experience, great place to live, not just for me, but our entire family really enjoyed the assignment.
Are there any experiences or takeaways that give you a different perspective from the average person?
Yes, I think, and I wouldn't say it's not just me, but I think any American who's lucky enough to have the opportunity to live overseas, and this gets back to what I was talking about in terms of the Tunisian elections, the liberties that we have in the United States that we take for granted, and when one's overseas, one realizes that not everyone, or at least in the places I serve, not everyone has those same rights and liberties. So be it voting, be it freedom of expression, be it freedom of association, be it just a more, we may not have a perfect society, but it's a lot more equitable in its treatment of citizens than a lot of other countries are. We're often a lot more open about confronting our problems and admitting them. We may not have the solutions, but at least we're trying to deal with them. So I think all of those things are enriching factors of an overseas career.
Right. You were also stationed in Iraq for a period. What was the focus of that assignment, and what role did you serve?
I was in Iraq from 2008 to 2009, and my role was to interact with our provincial reconstruction teams in the southern provinces of Iraq, and with Iraqis in those southern provinces. So tried to focus a great deal on governance, a lot of interaction with some of the provincial leaders, some of the provincial councils, also on infrastructure. There were tremendous needs in that respect. And so it was a challenging assignment because of the security situation at the time, but it was also fascinating just because Iraq is such an interesting country.
Right, and you say that was based on infrastructure. That must seem to me, was that out of your depth at all? I mean, that seems like rather different from your other assignments.
I mean, I'm certainly not an electrical engineer or a water expert or anything anything like that. So it wasn't at the degree of technical assistance or anything like that. But part of it was just seeing what the needs were, seeing if the programs being proposed matched the needs, and I had some degree of experience from a generalist perspective, not from a technical perspective, from having been in Egypt, where we had one of the largest agency for international development missions in the world, and a very robust assistance program for the Egyptians.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that, because it's always important to see how, at least in my view, how sort of these political insights can supplement stuff like engineering and infrastructure. Absolutely. And it's nice to know that you were able to give them insights on, like you said, the needs of the citizens. And because these are things that a lot of times they're not surface level, that people can't know unless it's their field of expertise.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's interesting to know. And so in Iraq, what insights did you glean from this experience? I mean, what were some memorable events maybe, or generally what was your big takeaway from your experience?
Well, One of the memorable events was, since it was 2008, 2009, I was there for the 2008 presidential election, and there was a great deal of interest in then Senator Obama's candidacy. I remember vividly going to Basra, which is the largest city in the south. It's a port city, and 1,000 years ago, 1,100 years ago, there was a African presence there. Africans were brought from the East Coast to serve as slaves there. And I spoke to an Iraqi of African descent who said he was so inspired by Obama's candidacy that he was running for the city council. He wasn't optimistic about his chances, but it was something that he felt like he had to do. Shortly after President Obama was inaugurated, he gave a speech in Istanbul, which got a lot of coverage in Iraq, and I remember meeting with a group of Iraqi students afterwards, and that was all they wanted to talk about. So there was a great deal of interest in this new figure coming onto of the United States political situation. And I would venture to say the fact that there was an American president elected whose middle name was Hussein, which is a revered name in the Shia tradition, was also noticed across the border in Iran as well.
Right. That's very interesting to know, because America, for a lot of other countries, is a sort of a paragon of democracy. Mm-hmm. And like you say, the citizens here are able to look at our politics, look at our elections, and like you say, it might even inspire them. Right. It really is kind of a beacon in some ways for countries to almost model.
I think that's a very important point, and I think it's one that we overlook too often, because again, we assume it and we don't realize the demonstration effect. And I'm not talking about not even on a political level, but on a societal level.
Right, and this is why it's perhaps extra important for our leaders to sort of set up model examples.
Exactly. Yep.
Because being such a high-profile society, we have to be aware that other countries, they look up to us.
Right.
And we wouldn't want them to.
We have a tradition to live up to.
Yeah, we do have expectations to live up to. Very true, very true. Currently, what do you believe to be some of the most important developments or issues happening in the North Africa or Middle East that may be overlooked?
One development which I wouldn't say it's overlooked, but I think it's important to note, is the return of, you can call it great power, influence, or competition in the Middle East that we haven't had to deal with as a country in maybe a generation. Russia's playing a resurgent role. I don't think that Russia serves as a model for the Middle East. I'm sure if you go to a Russian embassy in the Middle East and an American embassy in the Middle East, and say a Western European embassy in the Middle East, you'll see lines of visa applicants in front of the American embassy, in front of the Western European embassy. I'm not so sure you'll see one in front of the Russian embassy. But still, they're playing a bigger role. In some countries, China is playing a bigger role. I think that's probably more development in Africa, where the needs are greater and the countries have less flexibility than perhaps in the Middle East, North Africa, and particularly China isn't playing as much of a political role. So I think that's one development. I think another development that we should bear in mind is that even though, apart from Tunisia, as we've discussed, some will say the Arab Spring is actually an Arab winter, and that the situation in countries such as Syria or Yemen descended into civil war. But I think that the factors that contributed to the wave of protests in the first place, be it unemployment, be it ossified political systems, be it corruption, be it alienation, these factors haven't gone away. Just because there haven't been successful transitions outside of Tunisia, that doesn't mean that these factors have disappeared and people still don't have legitimate grievances. So even if Assad is able to restore order eventually in Syria, and that's a very tall task, the sense of grievances or remain. He's not going to be able to address those. And I don't think he's willing to address those.
Very important, because as we see, like, the Arab Spring is just like a more tumultuous period that sticks out to us in history, but it's important that these things are always happening, right, that we're aware of them, because it could, maybe a wave of protests could resurge again, or we never want to assume things are calm, or right, always assume that things could be brewing up, right, let's say. So, right, we do see Russia and China kind of having a more global presence, or at least attempting to have a more global presence. I think one situation which I recall vaguely is that China gave a building to a certain country, and then they bugged that building.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. For intel. So, how do you think the United States, like, what is our role in mitigating these external actors that may be malicious or against our interests or against the people's interests of that country?
Well, I think we have to realize in the Middle East and North Africa, that as vexing as the problems may seem at times, we still have a leadership role to play, and we shouldn't abdicate that leadership role. I think that another comparative advantage that the United States has is in trade, and I think we should be as aggressive, and I mean in the good sense of the word, aggressive as possible in seeking to bolster trade with countries, be it Middle East, North Africa, Africa, not only because it's advances our national interests globally, but also it's good for American businesses and American employment. And I think we have a lot better, U.S. companies have a lot better record than some of the Chinese parastatals, where, for instance, countries will sign agreements with China, and part of the agreement is the labor is imported from China. Well, that doesn't help the population any.
Right. So economic growth is important for these regions long term, because if they're just used, for example, by another state actor, then the region doesn't gain at all. And in fact, they are almost being exploited. Mm-hmm. Important is development, which is so that it's a two-way street. It's right, not just foreign businesses excelling. It's also domestic industry and exports.
Right, exactly.
So for the case of Russia and China, and this is a topic I'm very interested in, because as we know, we should always be aware of the global right, power dynamic and politics. So you say they're having an aggressive role right now. Do you see them perhaps pressuring this? Like, what regions do you think are most at risk?
From China, the primary focus of Chinese competition with the United States is going to be in the economic field. They've not been as aggressive in the political sphere, and I think at least in the Middle East and North Africa. And Russia, I think, is just more opportunistic. They don't have very much to offer in commercial terms, but they're probing to see where they can maybe put us on our heels politically, be it closer relations with Iran, be it interference in Syria, or interference with support for Syria, be it posturing vis-a-vis Venezuela. So I think that's more probing. That's typical of Putin as a former KGB agent.
Not to more general questions, how have your past experiences in foreign service impacted how you understand international conflicts and events? We talked about how intimate contact with these cultures really enlightens you, because someone who spends their life in the United States doesn't really understand the depth of foreign cultures and the way that they value, like you said, external influence from our country.
And just if I may, not so much value the external influence, but look up to the model that we provide.
Right. So how have these experiences really helped you understand international conflicts and events? Do you feel like, for example, when you hear a topic that you're not an expert on, how do you process that now that you've had experience in foreign service?
Well, it may sound a bit cliched, but I think that one of the lessons I've learned is that there a whole bunch, very few issues I've come across are black and white. There's a whole bunch of nuance, a lot of historical baggage in some cases, a lot of history always, and sometimes that's historical baggage. I would say that's certainly one thing that I've learned, and I think another thing that a lot of us have learned following the U.S. involvement with Iraq from 2003, 2000 on is beware the law of unintended consequences. And I guess that's the other side of maybe the other side of the same coin of a third lesson I've learned, which is U.S. isn't always, I wouldn't say humility is an adjective that's always used to describe American approaches to a lot of things. And I think in terms of diplomacy, a little bit of humility in realizing how much we may know a lot, but there's also a lot we don't know, and that goes a long way, I think.
Right, and that's important to note, because the worst case is always to assume things or to play an ignorant role. We should always be pursuing ways to understand things better.
Right.
And a lot of times, like you said, people domestically might not have that same level of understanding. I mean, some people sit in their chairs and think, well, boy, I could solve a problem like that, like Israel Palestine. Boy, how do they still fight over that? But it's really not that simple. And like you stated, I'm sure seeing these places up close really lets you know that not only are they people as well, but we have a lot of domestic problems. They have their own domestic problems. Sure. And there's layers to this that cannot be understood at a basic level. Certainly not from headlines and sensational news, let's say. If there is one important thing to emphasize for the audience, what would you like them to take away from our talk today?
I would want people to listening, and especially if they're students or young people about to embark on a career, to very seriously consider a career in public service. I think it doesn't have to be overseas, but and it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's lots of forms of public service, be it the military, the foreign service, teaching, EMT, whatever. But it's really a rewarding career, and being able to, in my case, in the case of my colleagues in the foreign service, being able to represent your country overseas is a real honor and privilege.
Well, Ambassador Gray, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, and we thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences with us.
My pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
If you want to learn more about today's guest, our mission, or our program, you can visit us at the PMBF website or go follow any of our social media pages. For the Middle East and South Asian Studies program here at UCF, this is Bryan Cruz. Thank you for listening.
I remember vividly, I spoke